Chapter 5, Section 2 is titled The Road to Revolution, and we're going to discuss the key events that sharpened the divisions between Britain and the colonists in the late 1760s and early 1770s. We talked about some of those events in Section 1, but there are others that continue to widen um, the uneasiness between the two parties. The Townshend Crisis. In 1767, the British government imposed a new set of taxes on the American colonies that were designed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, the gentleman there you see on the right. He was the government's chief financial minister. Taking at their word American statements that they did not object to taxes on trade, because Americans did say that, the Townshend duties taxed goods imported into the colonies and established a new board of customs commissioners to collect the taxes. This board of customs commissioners was also supposed to suppress or stop smuggling and to raise funds to free judges and governors from their financial dependence on colonial assemblies. See, judges and governors were paid by the colonies, and so the government, Britain thought, well, if we pay them instead, they'll owe their loyalty to us and not to the colonies. Although American merchants opposed the taxes, the duties, the colonial opposition developed more slowly compared to the response to the Stamp Act. Again, primarily because it probably only impacted a smaller group of individuals, as opposed to the Stamp Act that influenced a much larger group of people. Homespun virtue. A colonial boycott on imported British goods developed in Boston and spread to the southern colonies, where many southern planters hoped to use a boycott to reduce their debt to British merchants. A boycott, of course, is when you either don't spend your money on certain things. You boycott. Either you don't go to certain stores. For example, I do not eat, as good as it is, I do not eat at Chick-fil-A. I don't agree with the owner's beliefs. Hobby Lobby either. I will not spend my money at Hobby Lobby. So the best way to get the notice of businesses or companies that are doing or not doing something you like or don't like, stop giving them your money. And so the colonialists, stopped spending their money on British goods. The boycotters celebrated the virtue of American resistance and denigrated the luxury of British society by producing their own homespun clothing. So they stopped buying clothing from Britain, they started making their own. Although urban artisans welcomed an end to competition from British imports and strongly supported non-importation, urban merchants were at first reluctant to honor the boycott, and in some cities, extra-legal committees and crowds attempted to enforce it. Extra-legal means not legal. And so were these little groups, these little gangs, if you will, who went around and threatened people if they did not follow the boycott or participate in the boycott. The Boston Massacre. Boston was a center of resistance. Royal British troops had been stationed there since a 1768 riot against British attempts to enforce trade regulations, and the unpopular troops had been competing for jobs on the waterfront with the city's laborers. On March 5, 1770, a fight between Bostonians and British soldiers escalated into an armed confrontation that left 5 Bostonians dead. The commander and 8 soldiers were put on trial and defended by John Adams, who opposed both British policies and lower-class crowd actions against them. Though only 2 of the British soldiers were convicted of manslaughter and the rest were found not guilty, Paul Revere and other colonists helped stir up indignation against the British through inaccurate but widely circulated propaganda depicting the incident as a massacre of unarmed Bostonians. So this may have been one of the first incidents of fake news, something we hear a lot on TV today. Non-importation, which was the boycott, temporarily cut British imports by a third, and although the boycott on the Townshend duties faltered by 1770, British merchants' fear of future trade disruptions led to the repeal of all the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea. The British also agreed to remove troops from Boston, and American merchants abandoned the boycott. So all of this as a result of the Boston Massacre. So one of the things that Paul Revere did, of course, was to create an image of the Boston Massacre to help gain sympathy for the colonists. So here you have the Bloody Massacre that happened on King Street in Boston on March 5th, 1770, by a party of the 29th Regiment. So this is a kind of sensationalized portrayal of the skirmish that was going to later become known as the Boston Massacre. Again, this happened between British soldiers on the right in red, the redcoats, and citizens of Boston on the left. So on the right, you see a group of 7 uniformed soldiers, okay, right here. And on the signal of an officer, the gentleman here with the sword, they fire into a crowd of civilians who are on the left. 3 civilians lie bleeding on the ground, as you see down here. In the foreground, you also see a dog. In the background are rows of houses. You see the first church and the townhouse. Behind the British troops on this side is a row of buildings also, including the Royal Customs House, which is the customs house where they collected taxes. And it has the sign, probably on purpose, that says Butcher's Hall. Beneath the print are 4 sections of verse that I cut out of the image that you can't see, but it's kind of a little poem, if you will, an ode to the scene. And this was again printed by Paul Revere, so it was meant to solicit sympathy. The building that you see here in the middle still exists today in Boston. This is what it looks like today. So the old buildings to the left and right are gone, but this building still exists today. Okay, pretty cool. Wilkes and Liberty. A controversy within Britain over the treatment of John Wilkes reinforced Americans' sense that political corruption and other ills were eroding and rotting British liberty. A radical journalist who had scandalized authorities with writings on the king and ministry, Wilkes was elected to Parliament from London, but eventually expelled. Cries of Wilkes and Liberty rallied colonists and Britons to the mother country. British American Protestants were also troubled by rumors that the Anglican Church planned to send bishops to the colonies and worried that religious courts to punish dissenters would be established. That continued to breed more fear amongst the colonials about losing their liberties. The Tea Act. The next colonial crisis demonstrated how events throughout the British Empire would reverberate, would have a domino effect in America. The East India Company was a giant trading monopoly that effectively ruled the recently acquired British possessions in India. When a speculative bubble destroyed the company's stock, in which many British merchants, bankers, and other elites had invested, the British government decided to help rescue the company by marketing its surplus, the extra tea, to North America. By this time, tea was no longer a luxury good. It wasn't just for the rich. Everyone was drinking it. It was a consumer necessity popular among all social classes in Britain and America. The British government, headed by Lord North, gave the company advantages that allowed it to dump low-priced tea on the American market, which undercut colonial merchants and smugglers. When you offer something really cheap, it makes it unfair competition for everyone else. So the British offering very cheap tea to the American colonies, meant that the American tea merchants were not going to make any money. The British government also wanted to use the taxes on the tea to help pay for the costs of colonial government, another move that threatened the colonial assembly's control over finance, over the money. Although the tea tax was not new, many colonists argued that a tax on a large new body of tea imports would acknowledge Britain's right to tax the colonies. It was the point of it. The tax wasn't huge, it was just the fact that they were mounting this tax to begin with. So mounting opposition culminated in what much later came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists disguised as Indians dumped tea from British ships into Boston Harbor, causing enormous loss to the East India Company. And here you have Bostonians, they tarred and feathered. They would pour tar, take all his clothes off, cover him in tar, then cover him in feathers so it would stick. And they're forcing tea down his throat. So the guy who collects taxes, he may not want to collect taxes again. And the intolerable acts. North's government, Lord North, and the Parliament responded with a series of punishing laws that the colonies came to call the Intolerable Acts. The acts closed the port of Boston until the East India Company had been compensated for its losses. It altered or changed the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 by cutting down the number of meetings that they could have, and it authorized the governor to appoint council members that were previously elected. It also allowed British military commanders to house troops in colonists' private homes. The army could come and say, "Do you have a spare room? We want to put some soldiers in your house." And you could not deny the request. At the same time, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended Canada's boundaries and allowed for legal toleration of the Roman Catholic Church in that new British province. Meant to secure the allegiance of Britain's new subjects, the Quebec Act also caused many colonists, especially New England Protestants, to fear that the British now threatened both their political and religious freedoms. Remember, the Protestants were very nervous, suspicious of anyone who was Catholic. And so here you have this particular image, the Mitred Minuet, where you have the bishops kind of dancing around, celebrating the fact that maybe now they'll have a foothold in the colonies again. And of course, you see the devil here who's kind of pulling the strings. So that's the end of section 2. If you have any questions, as you read about the coming of independence, please send me an email or contact me. Thanks.